It's my pleasure to introduce the results from current research on pollutant export from bioretention systems and next steps. Chris May was listed, but he's not here. But Chris May from Kitsap County was part of this. Who we have on the panel is Doug Howie from the Department of Ecology, Dylan Ahearn from Herrera Environmental, Curtis Hinman from Herrera, Andy Rheaume from the city of Redmond, and John Lenth from Herrera. And I'm just going to let them get to it. So with that.
So I get to do the introduction here there, and I'll finish everything off, basically because I'm the grant manager for the grants that Ecology gave to the various jurisdictions to do these studies. And so what brought this about is back in 2009 when the LID manual was created, they created a default bioretention soil media. And that bioretention soil media was a 60-40 blend of sand and compost. And we then started doing some studies with that, and we started looking at a literature search, and we found that the literature search didn't really have a lot of things to talk about in the way of removing dissolved metals like dissolved copper and dissolved zinc. And so we wanted to remove dissolved metals. So instead of using the types of bioretention soil media that was being used in other parts of the country, who weren't looking for those dissolved metals, but we tried to find something that could remove those dissolved metals, hence using the organics in the compost. And we then started looking at those and trying to see what's going on. In the city of Redmond in 2011 and 13, because their bioretention facilities are sitting over their sole source aquifer, they were worried about nitrates coming through the bioretention facilities and going down in the aquifer. And lo and behold, we discovered that our default bioretention media mix was exporting copper, which was a surprise, and was exporting phosphorus, which was not so much a surprise. And so what we've tried to do at Ecology is we're funding through the grants of regional and statewide significance 3 different studies that are taking place right now. We've added 4 new bioretention facilities, full-size bioretention facilities in the city of Redmond, where they're monitoring both the influent and effluent and looking to see what kind of treatment comes out of that. Kitsap County has a study where they're looking at column tests of various different types of bioretention soil media. You'll hear more about how many there are and where those tests are being done when they talk later. And lastly, the city of Tacoma is taking water treatment media, the leftovers from water treatment plants, and using that to see if they can remove phosphorus with those medias. And so, without further ado, I'm going to pass this on to the people who are going to tell you what's been happening instead of what we were hoping was going to happen.
Thanks, Doug. I'm Dylan Ahearn with Herrera. We told Doug about 2 hours ago that he was going to do the intro, so I think he did a pretty good job. Lends a little more gravitas than I could have. So we're going to get into the numbers a little bit here and specifically talk real briefly about the 2 past studies that have been done in this region on looking at the efficacy of a 60-40 sand compost mixed bioretention soil media at treating stormwater, and then move into the current research we're doing now. So these 2 main projects that have occurred in this region are the work that's been done at the city of Redmond at the 185th Street extension, and also the work that Curtis has been doing at WSU. So what we found at 185th right off the bat, I don't know, who has seen results from either of these studies here in this room? Okay, a few of you. Anyways, these results have been presented a lot in the region, so we're just going to go over them pretty quickly. Zinc, it turns out, bioretention is one of the best treatment devices out there for zinc capture. Amazing, seems like no matter what media you use, really good zinc capture, especially the 60-40 mix. So that, right off the bat, we saw wasn't going to be an issue. What we were surprised to see in both these studies was export of initially TSS and then nitrate, phosphate, and copper. We knew nutrients came out of bioretention systems. That was in the literature somewhat. The magnitude was surprising. The magnitude of nutrient export we saw in Redmond was pretty surprising, but we expected that. The copper was completely unexpected and really wasn't characterized in the literature at all out there. And we think that's because when you go and look in the famous LID research synthesis out there like Dietz and Davis, those papers, they compile data from a lot of studies that haven't looked at this flushing phase at all. They're either lab studies or field studies, but they let the systems, they let the plants grow and they let them settle down, and then they start taking water samples. And so a lot of people sort of miss this whole flushing phase. On top of that, many different bioretention systems out there don't even include compost. So what we're doing in these two studies was pretty unique compared to what's been done in the literature. So this copper export was seen, again, at both these studies. And let's see. What we saw in Redmond specifically is, well, we saw all this nutrients and copper coming out. We asked ourselves then, well, where is it coming from? There's lots of different ingredients in this mix. And so we did SPLP extractions and determined that the copper is coming from primarily the compost, but also the sand fraction, and that the nutrients is definitely coming from the compost. So, and WSU, what Curtis saw, and he could tell you a little better, but I'll give a quick overview here. The same sort of dynamics, but just a lower magnitude. There was copper coming out, there was nitrate coming out, there was phosphorus coming out, but with the nutrients, about an order of magnitude less, but still higher than the influent. It was still flushing. And then the copper was about 2 times less coming out. So those results from both those studies sort of precipitated this whole thing. And here's what Doug went over briefly, is that the 3 additional studies that were funded was this study to look at different bioretention soil media in a lab setting, so with columns, so we could do a lot of different media at once and find out quickly what different mixes and different ingredients might work, but not a full field scale study, and that was done through Kitsap County. And then the Redmond study with 6 different bioretention systems, and I'll present those results next. And then Tacoma study, which we're not going to present today. So in Redmond, we had 6 full-scale bioretention systems, and 2 were again on 185th Street, but further down the road. So 185th Street's lined with bioretention right now, and all of it's being monitored. It's like a big lab out there. And then at Redmond's decant facility, they were upgrading the decant facility, and they needed treatment, so they put in some 4 additional systems there. And all 6 of these had slightly different media. And we did the monitoring following the tape protocol with continuous flow monitoring, automated samplers, the most rigorous type of monitoring you can do. And this is what the systems looked like. We had on the left up there, we have the MOC, the maintenance facility, and that ended up like pretty beautiful. It was like a Japanese rock garden with cascading waterfalls coming out of this central pump. And it went into these 4 systems, and the vegetation came in pretty nicely, and we had different media in each of the cells there, and then lined, under-drained, and auto-samplers and flow gauges at each of the outlets. And then on your right, you'll see 185th, one side of the street. We had a bioretention cell on either side of the street. And they were sort of bioretention in a box, and we had 2 different medias out there. And the underdrains were slotted underdrains in a type 26 aggregate, which was different from the original 185th monitoring project we did, where we had a perforated underdrain in a coarser gravel. And we believe this had an effect on TSS export, and would recommend the slotted drain in the type 26, which is what SPU Seattle recommends as well. So these are the media we looked at. We wanted to do the 60/40 again and see if we could duplicate what we did previously, a year previous, where we saw those really high export numbers from the original 185th study. So we did a 60/40 sand compost at the MOC, and then we dialed back on some of the compost and replaced it with biochar and with shredded bark to see if that could help with some of the export issues that we expected. And then we threw in 2 sandy loams at the MOC as well to see if if those type of mixes would do well water quality wise. And a lot of different jurisdictions around the country, they spec sandy loams. We've not recommended it in this region because the definition of what is a sandy loam is pretty loose, and so the hydraulics can be pretty unpredictable. And out on 185th, we looked at a char compost mix just like at the MOC, so we did duplicate that one because we thought it had promise. We'd seen a lot of interesting results from biochar, and we wanted to see how it would function with 2 different influent concentrations. And then across the street from there, we looked at something a little different, 80% sand and a 20% coconut coir. So it's the husks from the coconut shells that is sort of a byproduct of the coconut industry. And that was that mix. So getting into the results here. So all these results are sort of normalized by precipitation. And so instead of date down here, we have the precipitation received. And in this region, we receive about 3 feet a year. So we're about half a water year worth of rain that had come into these systems. And we're looking at total phosphorus here. And this is the average influent concentration is the dashed line here of all the systems. So the blue here are the char and compost, and then the red is the sort of coir, which is standalone, and then the two loams are green, and the 60-40 is the red one. And so what the goal is to sort of get below this influent concentration for sure. We want to reduce concentrations. But really it's to get down here. This is sort of this TAPE guideline of what, by TAPE guidelines, what's considered irreducible or very difficult to reduce. And so we'll see that there's flushing going on for quite a while. We're above the influent concentrations with the char and compost still to this day. And so those are sort of slowly flushing out with total phosphorus. The 60-40 did a little bit better, but still is just barely below the influent here. And the sandy loams are doing a lot better, but and they've sort of flatlined. And the coir initially flushed a lot of phosphorus and then dropped way down. So it looks like these three are working the best in terms of phosphorus treatment. So nitrate was the other parameter we're really interested in. Same graph here, except we have nitrate on the y-axis. And you can see that, and we've seen this in a lot of different studies. It's sort of interesting nitrate dynamics because you get mineralization of organic nitrogen in the compost as the system ages. So your inorganic nitrogen can actually increase with time as you get mineralization of the organic nitrogen. And we see that with time. Some of these concentrations are going up. And so the sandy loams aren't performing, again in green here, any better than the treatments with compost when it comes to nitrate. But our sand and coir is doing a good bit better down here below the influent concentrations, and that flushed out pretty quickly. Lastly is copper. And we've seen copper export of everything initially. The sandy loams were a bit lower than the influent concentrations, but then they've come up and have been hovering sort of with the other treatments, the other, again, 60-40, and the blue ones are with biochar and still some compost, are all sort of together now, right around the influent concentration, not exporting much, not decreasing any, really. But again, the coir, sand and coir has done a bit better, dropping down pretty quickly and reducing influent copper concentrations. So those are those results real quick, and I'm going to hand it over to Curtis here to talk about the column studies that we've been doing that have looked at not just those media types, but a lot of different media types.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for hanging in there to the very end. All right, so we're going to look at a different study. We're going to switch gears, kind of move inside in the lab, and this study has basically 5 components. The location is at Seattle University. What we've done in this project, and it's as with the other grants, a year-long project, and we started. We have an advisory group, and we started by casting a very wide net, thinking about what are all the different things you might think about using in a bioretention soil media. And thinking about not just pollutant capture, but water holding capacity. How are these things? How is it going to grow plants? Permeability, all those sorts of things, and identified a long list of candidate components through this literature review and consultation with the advisory group. And moving from there, then we did some screening using a weak acid extraction, this SPLP extraction. Same procedure that Dylan talked about earlier, and tested almost all the media components for nitrogen, phosphorus, and copper leaching, and then sort of looked at what were the best performers, which of these components sort of leach the least of these contaminants, and then worked putting together media blends with those components. And with this sort of, here were the kind of the main goals for that, for those media blends. Minimal labile organic material, higher CNN carbon nitrogen ratio than what we've been working with previously, high water holding capacity, stuff has to hold on to some water to be able to grow plants, pollutant capture, and good permeability. There's a broad term for you. At any rate, we had a minimum, but we did not have a maximum on that permeability. So put those media together, put those media in columns, and I'll show you a picture of the experimental rig here in a moment, and started first with flushing the media with deionized water, which is a very challenging test for media, and put 1 water year through those media, the DI water through that media. And so we've completed that phase, and we are now in the last phase here, dosing the treatments with stormwater that we've collected and then augmented if needed. Augmented, for example, with copper or nutrients if that stormwater is low in those contaminants. Along with those tests, we're also doing lab permeability tests, the D2434 that's prescribed in this region, and also falling head hydraulic conductivity tests in the columns, and then also plant growth and physical characteristics of the soil. So we're just getting the information back on those tests. So we have 8 treatments, replicated 3 times. Here is the experimental rig, as I mentioned at Seattle University. This was the fun part, working with Dylan and John and putting our heads together to build what we were hoping would be the ultimate experimental rig for synthetic stormwater delivery. Mixing tank here somehow we found a surplus big giant motor somewhere and with a propeller on it for mixing. And then distribution manifolds and distribution tank and manifold. What's pretty unique about this rig is each individual column has a peristaltic pump delivery, so it's very accurate. So this system is designed to deliver sediment in a synthetic stormwater blend and quite accurately through these peristaltic pumps. So, if you're a stormwater measurement experimental geek, this is the fun stuff. Okay, some of our ingredients, or all of our ingredients, the mineral aggregates, we used a volcanic sand right out of our very own Mount St. Helens, and also some wash sand that we located in southeastern King County that showed promise. Organic fraction, we used compost for just 2 of the blends. And then some pretty unique stuff. Iron-fused wood chips. We connected with someone in the Eastern Washington who had developed a biological process for fusing iron onto wood chips. The coconut coir, this is actually a bit different than what was used at Redmond, but from the same type of material, coconut. This is actually from coconut pith and sort of triple washed and slightly composted. And then these additives, diatomaceous earth, high carbon fly ash, granular activated charcoal, and activated alumina, and put them into these blends. And so I know this is going to be sort of hard to track here, but because there's quite a few of them, but put these things together into these different ratios into 8 different blends. 60-40 is our control. That's our default mix, right? So we use that as our sort of a comparative blend. The only other media that we used compost in was this 90% sand, 10% compost, and then a polishing layer with actually some fairly high-tech material, activated alumina, and bone char in the layer underneath that, in the drainage layer where the drainage pipe is located. So just to go back, I want to go back really quickly and also mention each of these columns have drainage layers, just like Dylan mentioned. A type 20, it's a sandy gravel mix, a type 26 with a slotted pipe, and that's where we collect our effluent samples. So if there Any compost suppliers in the room? No. Okay. Well, this is not a, this is, if you're a compost supplier, this is probably not your, the direction you'd want to be going. But yeah, we only have, most all the blends are no compost whatsoever. Very low organic material content and very high carbon nitrogen ratio. So quite different direction than where we've been. Okay, so looking at some of the tests, this is the SPLP extraction against just a weak acid extraction used typically on contaminated soils. And you can see some of the results up here from the additives that we talked about, and down here for copper and for orthophosphorus. Bottom line here is that these materials in these extractions were quite clean. A lot cleaner than other materials that we tested, the other sands that we've tested, and in particular compost. So very low levels of both of orthophosphorus and copper. Just to point out here, this is in milligrams per liter, so we're talking about 1 and 2 parts per billion here in those extractions. So that was promising. And here is some just initial data. You're the first to see any of this data. What you're looking at is all these different blends with whisker plots at each sampling event, the percent water year here, and these are the median values that these trend lines go through, and then the maximum value and minimum value. Well, in each of these graphs you're going to look at, the red line is the 60-40, the 60% sand, 40% compost. And in this case, you can see for orthophosphorus, what we've seen in the past, a lot of export of orthophosphorus, and at times increasing as time goes on. And we don't know at this point where orthophosphorus stabilizes or becomes less than influent concentration. Still, we haven't put enough time in yet to know where that trend line comes down. But the rest of these, you can see many of these blends coming in quite low for orthophosphorus. The one other blend here, this blue line, is the line with the 10% compost in it. So good news here. We see some of these blends are very low as far as flushing orthophosphorus. Nitrate, again, the compost, the 60-40 mix in red, you can see starting off very high as far as flushing nitrate. And the blue line, again, slightly elevated from the other media initially, but coming down to quite low levels with the other media. So good news there as well as far as initial flushing. Finally, dissolved copper. And again, 60-40 mix starting off quite high on dissolved copper, coming down fairly rapidly though. And some of the other media though starting off very low levels in the 2, 3, 5 parts per billion, which is probably about as low as we could expect out of these type of media without spending a lot more money. So some good news on the initial flushing. And some of these blends are performing quite well initially. And I'd say right now, there's 2 or 3 of these blends that are performing really well overall in some of the other tests we're doing as well. So stay tuned. The reports are going to be out February. And that will include all this data we've talked about and the dosing data that we're finishing up right now. So what are we seeing overall on this? Default bioretention soil media exhibits a prolonged flushing period for copper and phosphorus. So we've seen that over and over again in numerous experiments. The extremely high nitrogen flushing was seen in Redmond. We've not replicated that. We've seen elevated initial flushing of nitrogen, but not the really, really high levels seen there on the initial experiments in Redmond. New media components and blends exhibit less flushing than the default bioretention soil media. Good news there. And plant growth and the pollutant capture characteristics of the alternative media we can't really say yet. We're just getting data back on that. Again, these media, the new media, very low in nutrient and labile carbon And so we're gonna see how these things grow plants, but we're thinking about and working on ways that we can optimize plant growth even within these type of high carbon, low nutrient medias. So with that, Doug, you're back.
I know what you're all thinking. What are we going to do now with all this great data? That's what I get to talk about now, to identify what I think Ecology is planning on doing with all this great data. And we've got, on the slide, we have several steps that we're talking about. The first one is, while this is great data, we need to look at it more thoroughly. We need to vet the data. We need to talk to people. We need to get internally within Ecology talking about what we want to do and how well we like this data. We need to talk about people that are outside of Ecology and have that full conversation about what we want to do with this data. We don't want to make a step and do something and find out that, wait a minute, that was the wrong way to go. We want to make sure that what we're doing right now and what we're going to do in the near future about bioretention is well thought out and has a very good way of doing things, as opposed to just taking another step because we got to do something. We want to make sure we're doing the right thing as we're doing it. And so part of that is getting some additional follow-up research. The stuff we're getting now is good, and I like the data we're getting, and I like the fact that they're getting that data, but that's not the end-all and be-all. We need to get more research on what's going on. We need to optimize and finalize how do we get the best treatment that we can out of this bioretention soil media and make sure that we're getting what we can get out of that. We need to look at the hydraulic performance of this. They didn't talk about how fast the water goes through these medias. You need to make sure the water's not going through the media so fast that you're not going to get treatment. You need to have contact time in order to remove your dissolved minerals and dissolved metals. And so we don't want the water to go through this stuff so fast that it ends up in the bottom and it gets controlled by the infiltration rate of the existing soils and backs up into the media and soaks the media. So we need to look at the hydraulic performance of these and find a good hydraulic performance. And lastly, we need to come up with sizing guidelines. We need to figure out how to size a bioretention cell so that it's going to be able to do the treatment for the drainage area that's being directed to that bioretention cell. We have design guidance for our existing bioretention. Maybe with new media, we're going to have to change those sizing criteria a little bit, either make them larger, make them smaller. I have no idea where it's going to go, but we can't just say that the existing sizing criteria is the way to go. We have to think of some other ways of dealing with that sizing criteria. And potentially, I had them add potentially. In the original slide, they didn't say potentially. I had to make sure that there was some wiggle room for Ecology. Potentially, we'll be updating our bioretention, our default bioretention mix. We have a default mix in the manual right now, the 60-40 mix. We know there are problems with that, with dissolved copper, with phosphorus, and so potentially we'll be coming up with a brand new mix for bioretention media that'll come out of these studies, and maybe there's some other studies going on around the country that we can work in and come up with a nice mix. At this point in time, if we were to create a new bioretention soil media mix, we could only do it as a recommendation. We can't replace the existing one because without going out to public comment and having all the nice discussions with the public, we can't come out with a new default mix. So all we could do is come out with a mix that we'd say, well, we recommend you use this. You can still use the default mix, that's fine, but this one we decide this one's a little bit better, going to get better treatment, and we recommend you use it and hope you use it, but we can't tell you you have to use it at that point in time, at this point in time. When we come out with our next revision to the manual, next revision to the permit, we would be able to bring that in as a requirement within the permit or as more than a recommendation. And that's where we're trying to go from here. You'll have to stay tuned. We can't give you any time frame of where we're going to get this. These grants have to be done by June 30th of next year. The money runs out of the grants, so we should be getting results back from them by then. But to take that data and go through the processes we need to go through to come up with a final answer will take a while. So in the meantime, you've got the default mix to use for your bioretention. If you want to design a new mix, there's a procedure within the manual, within the volume 5 of the Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington for a custom mix. And if you want to develop that custom mix and bring that custom mix to Ecology and say, we'd like to use this mix, and give us data on what kind of treatment you can get with that mix, we'll be happy to look at it. But that's what you have right now. We haven't got this information yet. We're working on it, and we're going to try to coming up with that information. So that's it for seeing me up here. Thank you for sticking around.